Before we begin, I'd like to just thank the Humanities Research Institute, Inter-Seminar Initiative, Mellon Foundation, and the School of Art and Design for supporting our artists and residents. Tonight we get the pleasure of talking with Ruth Lantz. She received her Master's in Visual Studies in 2010 from the Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland. Her work's been featured nationally at numerous galleries and institutions, including the Rockford Art Museum, Russo Lee Gallery, Oregon Contemporary, Washington State University in Vancouver, Governor State University, St. Louis Artists Guild, Northern Illinois University, and Indianapolis Art Center. Her work was showcased at the Portland International Airport and at the Fringe Festival at Southern Oregon University. She was a presenter in Making a Better Painting symposium at the Hoffman Gallery at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. And she is the founder of Crit Connection, a project providing networking opportunities and resources to emerging and mid-career artists. Help me welcome Ruth Lantz.
Thanks, Patrick, and just thanks to the university for inviting me. I've had a really nice, full term here. So in this talk today, I just see my sort of position as a visiting artist to sort of talk about my progress over the years and how work can ebb and flow over time. So I'm actually approaching this talk a little differently than I normally would, and I'm going to kind of try and cover 10 years in 45 minutes, so we'll see how that goes. And I'm going to bring a little bit more of my personal narrative into it, which is something that I don't always do, but we're going to want to embed some of the more personal anecdotes. And my hope in that is to sort of bring to students how, as you go through life and your life changes and your circumstance changes, your work can ebb and flow over time. So throughout the talk, though, I'm going to talk about how my interest in how technology is changing the way that we see, and also how, specifically in America and American landscape painting, visions of technology and landscape are intrinsically linked throughout history. So just in the class that I am teaching, it's sort of thematically called Landscape 2.0. We've been talking a lot about how your personal experience sort of shapes your understanding of landscape as well as technology. So I actually grew up around here. I am Midwestern from Central Illinois. I grew up in Gibson City, about 30 miles north of here. And also I am part of a micro generation called Xennials, which basically means you grew up or were born between 1976 and 1983. So I am the last generation to have an analog childhood and then sort of transitioned into a more digital adolescence, early adolescence. So that AOL generation, I'm all about that AOL life. And I remember all the internets. And then at 18, I moved to Chicago, and we got this great thing called the Ethernet, and you could download an entire album of music in like 12 hours. And we just thought it was like mind-blowing. So as my physical landscapes were shifting, so were my digital landscapes. So as I was kind of going through these seismic shifts of adolescence and college, my physical landscapes were also changing. And then in 2007, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I had never been west before. This was a completely new experience for me. And I'd never really seen landscapes like that before, except for in, TV shows, paintings that I had seen, like the one pictured there. So they felt sort of foreign and wondrous to me. It was like this whole new exploration of the landscape. But also 2007, 2008 those were the years that Facebook became something that we started using. So my digital space was also changing again, as well as how Wi-Fi was becoming ubiquitous, particularly in public spaces. So in the back of my mind, I'm starting to think a lot about how our landscape is being shaped by these spaces, and just landscape in general, and the Western just sort of landscape is really being absorbed into my lexicon. But what I'm going to start out with here is I'm going to start with this is some of the first work I made outside of grad school. So I'm not going to show you any of the grad school stuff, but this is the first work that I made outside of it. This was also some of the first work I made right after I got my first iPhone and right at the beginning of sort of Instagram culture, which is one of the reasons that they are square. So this is one of the reasons that this is right when sort of photography was becoming a lot easier for everyone to have. But this painting sort of series started, the top left image is a photo that I took while I was just commuting on the bus. I didn't drive till I was like 39, so I just took the bus everywhere. And it rained a lot in Portland, so the buses were always kind of foggy, the windows. And my painting practice in general has always been rooted in like a basis of looking, and particularly thinking about how we look, or how the apparatus through which we look affects how we see or how we understand the world. And so I started taking these sort of like foggy window pictures. And then on the bottom right, I would paint this image of a foggy window. And then I started mediating. So I took another picture of that with a Holga photograph or a Holga camera. And then I would make the painting on the right. So the painting on the right is actually the finished piece that I would show, but it had gone through these sort of series of mediations. And you can start seeing the landscape coming out because there is this indication of horizon lines, and then through the light that is used is alluding to the landscape, but it's also sort of this play between representation and abstraction. Because I come from a history of abstract painting, and recently have just been moving into less abstraction, I would say. So as the longer that I live on the West Coast, I start to do more traveling in the Western United States, and then also my husband is from Wyoming, so we would go to Yellowstone, back and forth to Wyoming sometimes. And then as iPhones and Instagram became more ubiquitous and more people started having them, I started to observe that more and more people weren't actually looking or experiencing the landscape anymore, but they were experiencing it through this mediated technology. So you can see here that on the right, in the Instagram photos, everyone is taking the same picture as well. So I was, and a lot of this, there's lots of reasons for this. Like, there's always been tourism culture, and it has something to do as well with the park design of national parks, which is a whole other conversation we could have. But visually I became interested where our landscape conventions in the United States were coming from. So I started looking at a lot of old 19th century landscape painting. And I think it's important to note too that particularly on the photography, in the early photography, when these images were being taken, photography was really pretty new. So shots like these were not only was the landscape something that was new to the people who were seeing it. Landscape wasn't new. The landscape wasn't new. It was new to the people who were being presented it, the middle class white people. So both the photograph itself and the image was mind-blowing. But the conventions of, the Instagram conventions, this is when they were being born. So because of this, what I started doing was I went to a place in Portland called Scrap, which would be similar to the Idea Store in Urbana. And I started just collecting sort of discarded landscape photography. So like the top one on the left is just a photo that somebody got rid of. So it's a photo that was probably in somebody's house when they died. And then I just collected it. And I turned it into a screen print. And the screen prints on the bottom there, and then I would screen print them onto panels, and that was my initial essentially template that I reacted to as far as creating these paintings. So my initial interest in technology actually came from thinking about photography and how photography was mediating our experience of landscape. And then with these paintings, I was thinking a lot about like the ends, like the light leaks that come at the ends of the roll of photography. And I was also thinking a lot about just how photos are printed. So whether they're printed in a dark room or they're printed digitally. So I started limiting myself to a CMYK palette. And this you'll see reoccurring for a while in my work. And then everything was optically mixed. So the paint it's a lot of thin layers of acrylic paint. And so like if I wanted a purple, I would do like a layer of blue paint and a layer of magenta paint, and then just layer different values of that color until I got what I wanted. Nothing was like mixed, pre-mixed. It was just layering different colors. I also started to think a lot about surface and creating surfaces that were flawless and removing my hand. And David Reed was a really big influence for me with that. I saw a David Reed show in 2008 or 2009 at Reed College in Portland. And if you don't know his work, he is interested in more of like how film affects our understanding of the painted surface and light. And he is reacting to that with his images, even though his images are very abstract. But the thing that I was really drawn to with his work is even though they have a lot of gesture and a lot of visual texture, the surface, you can't see his hand at all. And so that is something that at this point I'm trying to bring into my work as well. And you can see a little bit of that here. It's really, really hard to photograph. But you can see on the picture on the left how I always paint flat so that thin layers can sort of, I guess, ooze over the edge as they, or sometimes I pour, or a lot of times I paint edge to edge. But you can see on the edge how the painting is actually it gets pretty thick, but it looks very flat and smooth. So things are really built up. And as I'm going through this process, I'm starting to think more about the surface and how, so this is probably, about 2015, 2016. So screens are becoming more ubiquitous in our lives. So I'm starting to think more about how this surface can emulate more of a screen. And so I'm thinking about screens. So as I'm doing this, I'm starting to see landscapes on screens just everywhere. Like I'd go into somewhere like Best Buy, and the TVs, I'd notice that like all of the TVs would be playing something like Planet Earth because they wanted to show how amazing their high definition image was, so they show it on a landscape. Or you bought a new phone and it always came with a landscape image, or people would put landscape images on their phones. So I was just seeing that everywhere that I went, there was always this sort of collapsing of landscape and screens. But at the same time that was happening, as images were getting more and more high def, our understanding of the landscape space was actually flattening because we were losing some of the spatial nuance, right? There wasn't as much atmosphere. So I started to research, and I wanted to find some support for why this was happening, or whether or not this, because I didn't feel like this was a new phenomenon. So these two books were The American Technological Sublime and then The American Sublime, which The American Sublime is actually a show catalog from Tate Britain. And the American Technological Sublime, the technological sublime is actually a word that was coined by Leo Marx in the 60s. And it was coined from his book, The Machine in the Garden, which is actually where was inspiration for the name of my talk, The Mountain and the Machine. But what he was drawing from was he was actually drawing from instances of literature, particularly thinking about like the transcendentalist, and how the transcendentalist would be like sitting in nature, and then far off like a steam engine would sound and it would break their peace. So how at that particular time in the country was the start of when we couldn't really have a choice as to whether or not we interacted with technology. So it was whereas like now we don't really have a choice, like technology is becoming part of us. And the 19th century was the point of when that was starting, where technology and humans were like really starting to become one. But when they're referring to technological sublime, essentially the sort of examples that they give are things like railroads, photography, television, computers, virtual reality, and the internet. And it's just things that are integrated into our society that when they started to occur, or when we use them, we can't quite explain how they work. Or like the normal everyday person can't entirely explain how they work, and so we're a little bit mystified by them. Now, when I first learned about the sublime, I automatically think of these paintings, and I feel like the sublime is a lot of times seen through very European lens. And I'm specifically thinking of like the dynamic sublime, where you think something is amazing and beautiful and you're kind of in awe of it, but you're also a little scared of it because you see nature, or you see a fire, but you have a little bit of distance. I also just think that European art gets privileged a little bit from the American paintings, which I'm more interested in for this particular project that I'm working on. Because I think there's a lot in art history, a lot of times it seems like American art starts in 1945. We don't ever talk about anything prior to that. But I've been researching a lot about how in America specifically, the technological sublime was, for better or worse, started to be linked with the sort of latter Hudson River School moment. And that dynamic sublime of being in awe of something while still being a little fearful of it really comes together in these paintings. And I think that, they're setting up the scene where, since they have this plane that you can enter in, or this plane here, they have that bit of distance between the intense mountain part. But it's important to note that, as these paintings were being made, it was an intense time of, the railroads were being built, photography was really hitting the scene, America was growing really rapidly. So it was hard for Americans, and by Americans, I'm meaning white colonialist Americans of the time, not to link these particular images with that idea of progress. Now, it would be irresponsible of me to not also talk about the underside of these paintings, because there's also a lot of not great things that these paintings also, terrible things actually, that these paintings also elevated, they're are linked to manifest destiny and that idea of pushing forward to the West, right? They help to shape that the landscape was powerful, and the more landscape that you had, the more power you had. They elevated that idea of God and country, which gives us a lot of problems in politics today. So all of those things are also tied with these paintings. But what I'm particularly interested in is how what is shaped and mediated by technology starts to come from this idea of this technological sublime that is present in this time period, and this merging of something that is technological and something that is a landscape that is considered to be beautiful beyond our own sort of understanding of it, really starts to merge in this time period. But a lot of this was even used as advertising, which I think also ties into some of my interest. But you can see even in prints that were in magazines, they're always merging this technological aspect and the nature. They would even use it in straight up advertisements, calendars that they give away for the railroads. So it was throughout the 19th century, they were just intrinsically linked, this idea of technology and nature. So as I'm doing this research, I'm thinking a lot about areas in my life where I have seen or experienced sort of early technological landscapes, or what my first experience with technology and landscape was. And what I came up with was the Oregon Trail video game was my first sort of understanding of an experience of like a landscape through technology. And so, which is sort of actually hilarious now that I think about it, because another nickname for the Exennial generation is also the Oregon Trail generation. And I was also living in Oregon at the time, so there's like all these different layers of the Oregon Trail for me. So to make these paintings, I went to YouTube and I captured screenshots of someone who had recorded themselves playing the Oregon Trail. And then I, at the bottom, I just made it a bitmap so it was even more pixelized. And then the mountains in the back, the gray sort of mountains, were stenciled on. And that was, again, sort of like a starting point for my painting. So they were just sort of acting as a stencil that I could use to react to. In these paintings, I also started thinking a lot about the glitch. And that was a way for me to start thinking about how I could interrupt sort of the traditional landscape narrative. And then it also, for me, was kind of harkened back to just abstract painting moves, so it was very painterly. And then at the same time, for me, painting is always the sort of tension between something that is very, very controlled and something that is much more improvisational, that you may lose control of, or that kind of does its own thing. So there's always a tension between those two things when I make paintings. And I feel like the glitch also played that role for me. It was just this act of improvisation that never necessarily knew what was going to happen. Here you can see them sort of in process. And then process is a big thing for me. So everything is hand done, even though they could be done, much quicker if they were digital. But I think that processing is really, really important in the act of making them and building those surfaces. There was a show with all these Oregon Trail paintings, and they also were all named after defunct technology companies that had some sort of allusion to nature in their title. So one of them, like Waveform was one of them, or Stray Light was another one. So they all just had, the technology companies were just another tie-in to nature through the way that they use language. So after the Oregon Trail project, I was thinking and looking for like more current ways that technology companies use this same sort of aesthetic and these same sort of paintings now. And so I started pulling from Mac desktop images. And the interesting thing about these, so the Bierstadt painting is on the bottom left, and then the other three are from Mac desktops. But the interesting thing about these for me is that they essentially took out the frontal plane and just cropped that, but replaced it with a toolbar. And the front plane is what gives us our sense of distance from the actual landscape. But with a screen, you still have a sense of distance because you're a removed viewer. So they just had that. They were replacing distance in a little different way. But you can tell like the light is similar. That sense of like epic landscape is similar. And then I also think that conceptually, there is this sort of invitation for searching or exploration that they are hearkening back to from these earlier landscape paintings that the digital companies are. There's like this sort of subconscious lineage there. So this is one of the paintings that you can see, like kind of the theorist map outline. So I was just making those stencils as well. And while I'm doing this, I'm also thinking of other really abstract painters, thinking a lot about abstraction and how they think about the sublime or even just visual linkages. But the painting on the right is a Barnett Newman painting, and he was approaching the sublime, thinking about perceiving just like an instant of seeing, or how he could destroy something, which I also think ties in with that idea of glitching. Plus the fact that it just looks like a color bar, and there's all has that sort of tie-in with just the aesthetics of technology. So there's all these sort of different linkages there for me. This was also the first painting that I used a wireframe indication in the mountain in the front right of the painting. And the reason that I started doing that was because so many of these Western landscape paintings are complete lies, and they're just totally constructed spaces. Like this painting is at the Seattle Art Museum, and when he painted it, he had never been to Washington. So it's just, you know, he's just making it from like stories people have told him, or maybe sketches people have given him, but it's just, basically it's just to kind of convince people that they should go, but it's a completely, it's like, you know, the first Photoshop or the first deep fake. It's just like completely made up. And to me, that is fascinating because, and why I'm using wireframes, because wireframes are a show of something to come, and they're kind of like a stand-in for creating and creation in a digital space. But they also have, they're also interesting to me because they have this illusion of three-dimensionality in digital worlds, but they're actually very visually flat. So I start to play more with sort of condensing space in the paintings and having these sort of romantic vistas, but that are condensing visually. So I'm pushing and pulling space in a little different way. And all this time, my surfaces are still removing my hand from the surface. And I'm still playing a little bit with the CMYK palette, and everything is still optically mixed. So I'm still playing with all those ideas. And I've also started to play more with negative space and this idea of the grid. So the grid is silk screen. And for me, it does a few things. So it alludes to the grid in Photoshop, so that layer of transparency, which I'm sort of fascinated by that because it sort of signals that there is either an erasing of something or this potential for something new to be added. So there's this almost like unfinished aspect. And again, it reminds me of this sort of Agnes Martin. You can't use a grid like that without reminding me of Agnes Martin. And then how Agnes Martin's grid actually comes from her looking at trees, and just how the nature tie-in there is really interesting for me. I actually had this whole like 2-month conversation in the studio with myself as to how Agnes Martin would feel about Photoshop. And so I've decided that she would be a reluctant user of Photoshop if she was alive today. Now, another thing that I've been exploring with these paintings is just the idea of atmospheric space and how that has shifted as digital spaces have essentially condensed atmospheric space to the point where we don't really even perceive atmospheric space in digital worlds very often. And these paintings were all about atmospheric space, right? So that is what partially created the epicness of them. This is another constructed landscape. You can see the quote by Kay Walking Stick on the right. But so these are a couple of works on paper, but here I'm really thinking about how I'm pushing the blurriness to the front, and then what traditionally, the clear parts that would traditionally be in the front further to the back. So I'm playing a lot with this sense of opticality and thinking about how we see things, and trying a little bit to thwart that, just to kind of push and pull this space in different ways. But I'm still incorporating, you know, the Mac mountain shapes, I'm still incorporating the wireframes and building up those spaces, but really pushing atmospheric space in a little different way so that it sort of privileges the sense of depth. And this is, so I'm getting to the newer paintings where you can start to see how this sort of lexicon that I have been building is starting to sort of coalesce. So here I've got the glitches happening, there's the wireframes, there's the atmospheric space that's pushing forward. I've built in a little bit of gradients, which alludes to sort of other digital languages. So I'm starting to build all of these different things into my paintings. And this is the one that was in the show. This is really the first painting, I would say, where I've started to experiment with a little broader range other than the CMYK, and then using a little bit more flat mixing, like this is the deep purple, and it's a flash paint, so that was actually mixed just flat and painted on, where it's not that sort of layering in order to get my color. But I'm really just, all these sort of steps have sort of got me here, where you can, you know, the mountains are pulled from screensavers. The wireframes have this kind of alluding to something that's being constructed, but sort of a tight space. The Photoshop grid alludes to something that's been taken away. The glitch is interrupting the space. There's this kind of strange atmospheric area that's overlapping the flat plane in the front. So there's all these different sort of aspects of these different elements that I've been working with. These are just some details because it's a large piece. And then just so you can see sort of the lineage between the two. And then I think it's just important, you know, why I choose to make this work or why I'm interested in this work. I just want to, you know, show the ties between the American romantic ideal and how that has led to sort of our technological sublime world. and then the contemporary painting. So I think is this lineage there that we're following, but at the same time, I want to question and think about like how screens have shifted our understanding of images and space, and how that is condensing the more ubiquitous screens become. But also I want to play with those traditional notions of landscape and sort of interrupt that traditional plane of the landscape, just so that we don't always sit in this 19th century idealism, because we shouldn't, and kind of imagine what that should be. So that is why I make the work that I make. And then the other thing that I just want to talk to you about is this program that I run, Crit Connection. And so Crit Connection is it's a resource sharing and networking program for artists. And I started this, the first connections were made in February of 2021. So it was actually right after I moved back to Champaign, Urbana. But what this is every month I will introduce artists to each other. So right now there's about 60 people in the program, and they range from all over the place. There's people from the United States, Canada, Netherlands. Since 2021, there's probably been 250 people go through the program, but it averages about 60 people at a time. But one reason I started it is because I think when I first got out of grad school and undergrad and grad school is that I thought networking was sort of icky. And I thought that, you had to like schmooze, and it was sort of like, I didn't really like doing it, but I also I don't think I understood what it was. I think that I always felt like I had to go to the top of the person, or the top tier, like I had to introduce myself to the curator at the MoMA or whatever. But really, when you think about networking, you want to think about sort of it's more about growing your base of connections, and thinking about it more like a pyramid, because everybody you meet knows somebody else, and then you can build that pyramid up to the curator at the MoMA. But it's more about just expanding the people that you know. And I think it took me a little bit to get to that mind shift. But the other thing that I do through this program is I hold special events. Like Erica Hess of I Like Your Work has had a workshop with us on open calls, and John C. did something with us about artist statements, because what I hear over and over and over again through talking to people is they need more professional development, because they feel like they get out of school and they know how to make art, but they don't know how to be an artist. And so it's another reason this group exists, is so that we can all sort of help each other stumble through it as we learn how to be artists together, I guess. But I do set up professional practice workshops and things for people through this program. But I guess one thing that I would say to all of you as you work through school and you get out of school is just all of you have different skills, and you will all be better at, some of you will be good at writing, some of you will be good at, photo editing, some of you will be good at social media, and share those skills with each other. I think it's really important for you all to be really generous with each other. Like I was really good at organizing people, and that's one reason I can do this. But some of you, that won't be your forte, but you'll have something else that you're good at that you can share. And I just think being generous with people as an artist will get you further than always asking for things. So that will be my words of wisdom for the talk. And then this is me. That's my Instagram. That's my Illinois email. And that's also my personal email, just because it might be easier to reach me there. But I'm going to open it up for questions if anybody has any. And thanks.
We got about 10 minutes, yeah.
Ruth, I got a networking thing for you. Do you know Sharon Loudon and her Living and Sustaining a Creative Life?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know Sharon?
I've taken a workshop with her.
Because I was going to say she would love your attitude.
Yeah, we've had some correspondence.
Yeah, she's all about being generous. Artists be generous to each other and support each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've had some correspondence, but
yeah,
she's a busy lady.
Yeah, she is. She just retired from Chautauqua though.
Yeah.
So she's a little less busy right now. But that's less busy for Sharon.
Right.
Yeah. But I did have a question about the work. Something that really intrigues me about it is the sort of juxtaposing the history and tradition of the American landscape sublime, and David Nye's American technological sublime, which was like about things like the Hoover Dam and about
Atomic bomb, and
yeah. That sort of awe and that sort of thing. With these what did you call them? The grid.
The wireframes.
The wireframes, yeah.
Yeah.
The wireframes describe the landscape as sets of data points.
Uh-huh.
And so in a way, what the difference to me between the Bierstadt and the screensaver is that with that atmospheric, the notion of space and the notion of the sublime in the Kantian sort of sense, there was a real, and it's a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, it's this imperialist vision, churches, our flag in the sky, painting, literally about manifest destiny, about, the railroads, all souvenirism, all the things that you were talking about. But on the other side of it, one of the things that made it compelling was also the sense of embodied connection to the earth.
Right.
So that's also present in that work. So you've got this very sort of, and then this sort of, that's like the thing that seduces you in, and then the imperialist narrative is the propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
So then, when I see what you've taken from that in order to critique it in your work, you've got these data points that describe the landscape, which would seem to be very not embodied. But then there's something about the way you use your materials, and when you said that it does what it wants, then I started thinking like there's a real sense of the bodily with the way you use your materials. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think that's why it's important for me that there's such a process and that they're so intensely handmade, because that is like I'm so interested in tension, right? There's so much tension bumping up between like what's handmade, what's digital, what's landscape, what's abstract, and I think that tension for me brings it back to that body or that humanness or that materiality. And I think, because I think that that is one thing that you only get in person, where you're like, how is this? This is made by hand, and it's like that cognitive shift, right? That brings you back to this human thing. that I think is missing here, right? Like you would never get that, it's like, whatever. But I think that's like the reward, and that's where you come back to being human again.
I think knowing that they're paintings gives us access to that,
Yeah.
activates those mirror neurons over the stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's,
I mean, it's kind of like the same experience I had with the David Reed. And I was like, what? You know, just that like, oh my God.
Yeah.
You know? So I think that's
yeah,
the embodiment for me.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of my time this semester also looking at looking in the systems we look through and things like that. And I'm also really interested in these wireframes in your images and how they represent like information about angle and distance that is a lot more interested in like the transfer of information from like a physical image into our mind than it is actually like representing something. And I'm really interested in some of these like visual techniques that you recreated with the hand, as you were just saying, like this out of focus element, or the way that like the material of the paint would peek through in some of your glitchier paintings. And I was wondering if you just have anything to say about that and how you're thinking about systems and looking now this far into your research and your work.
So how I'm thinking about systems in just like a general way, or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is it looks like you're looking at looking really differently now that you've been talking about screens and data and information, and I was wondering how much your views on the matter have changed since you started looking. I guess that's it.
Well, I think they've changed. I think my views on looking have changed as our devices through which we are looking have changed. So I think that as our world has become more screen-based, you know, my ideas of looking have become sort of wrapped up in how we look through screens, or how our information is brought to us through information points, you know, as opposed, you know, like, you know, I teach a remote Zoom class where I was on a 5-hour Zoom meeting yesterday. It was terrible, right? But like, that's how we see each other now. It's like a very different experience. And I think that just understanding and thinking about how we are interacting with spaces and people is like affects the way that I paint.
Mm-hmm.
So does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think the screens are a really good angle. A lot to think about.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So process is like super important to you, obviously. I'm wondering how much you plan out a work and what's improvised. Like, do you have a process you always go on?
I don't. So I would say that these are very, very tight improvised paintings, which is kind of interesting. But like, I'm gonna flip back a few, so don't run them. Actually, this is easier. I can do it this way. So a lot of times I will start with like a main source image. Like if you look at this paint, this like finished painting here, and then this process shot, you can see that that is all the way underneath. And then I've actually glitched most of it out. So there's this whole painting like happening underneath it. So I start with like a main sort of thing that covers the whole painting usually. And then I react to that. So a lot of times I listen to the painting. Like I listen to like what is on the surface and then kind of react to what is happening there. Would these go a lot faster if I made digital collages and just copied them? Yeah, absolutely. But that's kind of just that's not my process and how I work through it. I kind of start with this like base template and then work through it that way and process through it that way.
So you would have to make this in order to make a digital collage.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm, I don't know, backward.
It's better that way.
Yeah.
It's better this way.
Yeah.
Wait, what did you say you were? A zillennial? What?
Exennial.
Exennial?
Part Gen X. I have the cynicism of a Gen X and the optimism of a millennial. Apparently. But, saying that, that's definitely dependent on my white middle class, lower middle class sort of access to the internet upbringing. It's all about sociological norms too, and what I had access to.
It's like being born on the cusp astrologically.
100, yeah. I'm almost one of those too, so I'm just a cusper all over.
Hey, are you still working with mountains now that you've lived here for like a year and a half?
I am, yeah. I'm still. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes the longer that I stay here. But as of right now, I'm still working with the mountains.
There's something about the grid in cornfields that like, it's like a flattening effect.
Mm-hmm.
That like your paintings have that like, I don't know.
Well, I think there's a lot of merging of like the two worlds, right, happening for me, like the grid and then like this world that I was in for a little while. But I always felt really like when I was living in Portland in these sort of mountainous landscapes, I always felt like an observer. Like I never really felt at home. It always felt like I was on the outside looking in. So it almost felt more natural to view that through the lens of like a photographer or a painter or something. It always seemed like I was, I don't know, some sort of ethnographic sort of observer or something. Other questions?
I'm just like, just chewing and trying to think about how I'm able to locate these and you and me in this legacy, this canon, right? Like, there's the artists, everything that Maria articulated, that are looking, embodying, obviously being used in different ways in terms of propaganda. And then there's the artists that are, speculating from hearsay, sketches, photographs. And while these are of course more sophisticated than just Xeroxes, they're this other type of speculative gesture that's layered. And I'm like sitting here trying to tease it all out. You have many layers of different ways of speculating.
Right.
Here. Like you're engaging with these histories of studying from the study, these kind of moved elements. You have this really labored hand effort to and I'm wondering if the claim is right. I don't know how loaded that is. Like you claim something for this labor-intensive process, or dispel something. And I'm like, it's like it sits in this space that's like hopeful and very scary. All I can think about is like the movie The 13th Floor that dissolves into like this digital space of like this or what's the other one? Dark City, like these constructed spaces that are not even dystopian, I would say horrific in the same way as like me and my embodied self, like one day trying to imagine life disembodied, living in a space station as a point of data, where everything I experience, or the thing that I see as myself experiences, is completely digital. I might romanticize this past that I can't have access to anymore. Like, it gets me to these other forms of speculation. So I don't even know if there's a question in here. I'm just like, just chewing. And I know we only have so much time, and I still got to think about this and tease them all out. But I just wanted to share that explosion of vomit that came out of my mouth. Just to how I'm thinking about like, now that I'm sitting with your work through your words and through your biography of how that you were so generously shared with us.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot there.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I want there to be this sort of latency, right, where you're like uncovering something and then you go back and you're like, oh, but what if it's this, or what if, and so I don't want the read to be easy. I want you to get a little scared and then be a little wonderful and then go back and forth between the two.
I have a whole mess of questions. We don't have to go through them all. But there are things you said in your talk that you let just kind of lay, and those are some of the things that I just had follow-up questions on, and I guess I'll just poke at one at the top of the list. You said you wanted to let go of your hand in the work, like your visible hand in the work. Right?
Visible hand, yeah.
Right? But your labor's there.
Right.
But what, like, besides seeing the David Reed painting, what inspired you to want to go that
Well, the
direction?
David Reed paintings, and then also just thinking a lot about the sense of removal that I was feeling, just like in my life.
Oh, being removed, okay.
Being removed, and then also just emulating like the experience of looking through a screen, right? And how there was this sense of removal there, and then also like I was thinking about the sublime and how in the dynamic sublime, there's always a safe distance. So I think creating a sense of distance and kind of a sense of coolness in the paintings was important through the surface.
That sort of lines up with what you said about your feelings about the landscape, the mountainous landscape. And as you were talking, I was reminded of this Susan Sontag quote.
Yeah.
So I found it. No one who wholeheartedly shares in a given sensibility can analyze it. He can only, by whatever his intention, exhibit it. To name a sensibility, to draw its contours and recount its history requires a deep sympathy modified by revulsion.
Yeah.
So like the idea of that distance that permits you to do this analysis that identifies this tension between the bodily connection to a real landscape and the terror of being confronted with the landscape that is only data points on a grid.
Yeah.
So they're like, so the technological, the terror of the sublime that is there for me ends up being that terror of the void, of the idea of like not bodily existing, which is a annihilation, but yet a kind of annihilation that our screens are constantly telling us we ought to want.
Right.
So that's why I appreciated also the material use, so that like there's hope.
Well, I think again, for me, it always goes back to tension, like hope destroying something, hand versus not a hand. So there's all these things bumping up against each other for me constantly. The studio's a real chaotic place. It's just angry at itself all the time.
Sounds like there's a lot of narratives that come out of your process too, though. Like something you got me thinking. And now also, both of you said something about the wallpapers, and it has me thinking about the emotional element of like, you have this wallpaper as your landscape, the implications that you're not there, and you wish you were. And like that distance, it's great, it matches up with this distance that you're talking about feeling in the place. And then there's this this other narrative of like technology as place that like comes up, and it, when we were listening to movies, it had me thinking of this Jason Segel movie on Netflix, The Discovery, and it's the idea that like this character invents a piece of technology that allows us to like witness the afterlife. But it's like it's mediated by this like helmet that you have to put on, and you can only temporarily like go there through this technology. But that is enough proof to cause just this like massive wave of suicides. Everyone's like, I want to be there. Let's go. You know.
Heaven's Gate.
Yeah, basically. But it's like portrayed as this beach, and it's this foggy beach, and you can't really see very far. And you know, it's like these paintings. It's a place. It's virtual. I don't know. There's no question in there. I thought that there might be one, but just
I appreciate the comment.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.